I remember that week and how painful it was and what we were going through and everything. And then the funeral and the viewing line, everything's just crazy. You have all these weird feelings. But there was LaVell Edwards and Patty during that week of the Utah State game that came to the funeral viewing and shook our hand, me and my wife, and comforted us. And I'll never forget that.
Welcome. We are so proud to have Dick Harmon on with us at Beyond the Game. Dick has, now when I did the Wikipedia on him, it looked like he'd only had 4 decades of journalism in sports, but he did reveal, because I remember his name on the articles back in the days I was here, which was more than 4 decades, or a little more than 4 decades ago. Dick Harmon, journalist back then for the Daily Universe, the Provo Daily Times, and now for the Deseret News. Welcome, Dick.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it, Mike.
It's good to have you here.
It sounds like you got a fun gig here going. You must love it.
You know, it's really fun. You asked a little bit earlier, what the heck caused me to do this? I retired from the financial services industry, was a portfolio manager at Merrill Lynch and Morgan Stanley. And 4 years ago, so what am I gonna do now? And just getting together with the old teammates back then, we, so frequently we had stories that we would share. And I think these stories have to get out. I was golfing with Mark Wilson, and Mark told the story behind the scenes. I was there behind the scenes back in 1979 when we're going into the Texas A&M game. And only weeks earlier, he had that appendectomy, emergency appendectomy. And then he told me what happened right after discovering that and the miracle of getting him in that game. I said, Mark, will you come on the podcast and share that story? Because it's fascinating. And for every team, every game, every season, there are stories. And Dick, you probably know more of those stories than any of us, having followed teams here in Utah for quite a while.
Hopefully I could share some, but I don't know if I get them on demand. I mean, my brain's rattled. I mean, I've seen a lot of great things, and I'm grateful that I was given the opportunity to work in a newspaper and be close to coaches and players, getting to know them. And back in the day when we go in the locker room, or we could go take some people to lunch or have one-on-ones, it was the most valuable thing. I hate journalism today.
Why?
Because when you go into a press conference and they have so many people and so many bloggers and digital people now that it's not just 4 or 6 reporters.
Maybe not as professional as it used to be.
Well, back in the day, you could get closer to people. But now they bring them in like they're at a feeding trough, and there's 30 people. And there's nothing wrong with that. They all got jobs to do. But for them to manage it, they need to bring them together all at once, one at a time, bring the athletes out rather than have them do 15 interviews. They bring them out so that you could do the interviews all at once. And that's the way they have to do the housekeeping of college and NFL and the NBA now. It's very rarely, but you can get it a one-on-one. They do that, but they try to avoid it because it takes the time of that athlete, and you got 15 people asking for that. So back in the day, we could go in a locker room after a game, and you could get players to play off one another and joke with each other about what happened on the field, and have a good time of that. And you'd be a part of that and be able to write a story and create that fabric and tapestry of that game.
Yes.
You can't do that now because you're at a press conference. You got microphones up there. The cameras are all there. And there's no intimacy there.
It's almost scripted, maybe.
Oh, absolutely.
And if you did get an athlete by himself or herself, they might be worried that you're going to do a gotcha.
Right. Yeah. So, back when I started, it was all about relationships. It was about building trust. It was about getting people that would help you to create your stories, and they would share things off the record so that you could understand the background of what happened, and then they could trust that wasn't going to come out from you and embarrass them or point to them as the source. But then there was on the record stuff that would be part of what you wrote. So that's the part that really, really I got into journalism for.
I can see where you'd say, sometimes I dislike journalism, but what an enjoyable job to get to see this stuff in the background. You bring up a moment when you talk about going into the locker room. A couple weeks ago, we visited with Brent Johnson. And you remember 1979.
Oh, absolutely.
And Brent, I'm serious. He and I both were on this set crying because he told a very uplifting story about how that was all handled afterwards. But he did say, and this was fascinating to me, that after the game, I won't belabor too much, but he was kind of walking to everyone, the Indiana team was all excited, like, unbelievable. We did win the game, even though it was a chip shot field goal.
They won a game they should not have won.
Exactly. And Brent saw all of us expecting the enthusiasm, and all of us were just like him, feeling down, like, what just happened? And so he turned around, he hung his head, he was walking, jogging, I don't know, back to the locker room there in Jack Murphy Stadium. And someone's fist grabbed his face mask, and he could tell who it was from the ring. It was LaVell Edwards. And he told the story about, just LaVell said, you and I are going in there together, And then he talked about in the locker room, he was just sitting there sobbing, and he always was lockered next to Mark Wilson or close to Mark. And he said when they opened the door for the media, everybody was making a beeline to his locker. And what was fascinating to Brent is everybody, what happened, And he's just sitting there crying. And so Mark Wilson steps up, hey, guys, give him some time. Give him some space. And it was cool that the media, in your respectful way you talked about it, they gave him space. They backed away, came back when it was a little more convenient. And that moment and I was there in that locker room, so although I don't remember it like Brent does, that's fascinating to think that, there was a story, everybody wanted it, but Mark Wilson stepped in and the media and Mark did the right thing.
That, Mike, that reminds me of another scene. Heisman Trophy year for Ty Detmer. It was 1990. They play
Hawaii.
They play Hawaii. They lose after the presentation. They end up playing in a bowl game, and I think it's against Texas A&M. No, not anyway. They go into that game, and before the game, they're making all kind of taunts towards Ty, winning the Heisman Trophy and then losing Hawaii.
The A&M players.
So in that game, they called so many blitzes on Ty, and they hit him. They beat him up. They separated his shoulder. They separated the other shoulder.
That's right.
And then when he's laying on the ground, writhing in pain, some of the players later on the game were mimicking that, getting on there and just writhing and making fun of him. And I remember in the locker room after that game, going in there to talk to him and to interview him, and he had ice packs on both shoulders, and he had tears in his eyes because he's from Texas. He was the high school player of the year as a junior in Texas, and he broke all kinds of records, superstar.
Against a lot of good teams. They played a lot of good teams.
Played Kingwood, played Aldine. He was at Southwest High School in San Antonio. But anyway, we're standing there talking to him, and he's got tears in his eyes and is in tremendous amount of pain. But Mike, he sat there, and he took questions for almost 40 minutes, and he never turned away anybody, and he never refused to talk at all about anything that had happened in the game. It was one of the most inspirational things I've ever seen. And there were other things that happened with Ty earlier before he ever became a star in Provo that I'll never forget.
Interesting. See, you've been there from the beginning, and then raised in Utah. You may be aware. I'm very proud of my father-in-law.
Oh yeah,
Dean L. Larson, who played for Stan Watts back in the 1950s.
Yep.
They won an NIT in 1951. Dean became an All-American. So I like to look up at the banners and see my father-in-law up there with Jimmer Fredette and Danny Ainge.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Do you remember any of those? I mean, you would have been extremely young.
I was not in any way, shape, or form in that time. I was just a baby then. But I have met those men. I've sat at a table with them. I've interviewed each one of them when they got together at a reunion, and they're part of the greatest generation. They were part of and they were a team at BYU that mustered the strength and the passion and the ability and the talents that they had to do something that nobody thought could be done in Provo. Winning the NIT there was like in the NCAA.
Exactly.
Because the NCAA was not really a thing and it wasn't a big tournament. The NIT was.
It was.
And they won it.
And, we have in our family, this is like an heirloom, but it's, not a videotape, the old, what we used to watch, film, and it's black and white. This is BYU against the University of San Francisco. So this was Bill Russell, one of the famous, he ended up being a great and famous center for the Boston Celtics. And BYU is playing the USF Dons, I think, in San Francisco. And BYU beat them that year. In fact, it was the last loss that USF had before they set the record that eventually UCLA would beat of continuous or sequential wins during a season. So BYU had a wonderful basketball program. Stan Watts had to be one of the best coaches ever, probably. And so BYU, I believe, back in the 50s and 60s, was probably considered a basketball school.
Oh, absolutely. And what Stan Watts brought to BYU was a fast break, kind of a brand of basketball where you would just run up the court and you'd push it as hard as you can because they knew that they athletically couldn't really stand toe-to-toe at half court, against the Wilt Chamberlain but what they said, we will run it and we'll pass it and we'll shoot it and we'll do that better than anybody else. So that was his philosophy. A lot of fun to watch.
It almost brings you to what we're currently doing in basketball.
Yep, exactly what happened last year. They would, with the three-pointer, they didn't have the three-pointer back then, but that's what BYU tried to do, is to use that one thing and perfect it the best that they could to have an advantage over other teams. And they were one of the top three-point shooting teams in the country.
And that advantage was something that, as a son-in-law, I did not like. I wasn't a bad basketball player when I was a kid, but my father-in-law used to kill me in games of horse or pig, because he could sit out there and make two-handed set shots from what I considered half court. And what the heck? I mean, these guys could really shoot back then.
Shoot it, yeah.
They could. And watching that old film of BYU against USF, the game has changed significantly, but how fun to see Bill Russell and my father-in-law and all those great basketball players from both teams on that court back then. What happened? See, I went on a mission 76 and 77. And when I got back, our BYU basketball program, I got back in the winter, so I got to see basketball. And there's this long, tall, kind of, shaggy-haired Danny Ainge out there on the basketball court doing all sorts of great things. It looked like basketball was still the sport of BYU when I got back from my mission.
Yeah, when you were gone, well, it was before you went on your mission. Krešimir Ćosić, the opening of the Marriott Center in '72. I mean, it was packed and he was remarkable. One of the best players in the world, known all over the world.
I
still
saw him
today.
play against UCLA on TV.
Yeah,
he
unbelievable.
was phenomenal.
But Danny represented. In fact, I just had an interview with Roger Reid because he was hired as an assistant to the late Frank Arnold that passed away this
just
weekend.
a couple days ago.
Right. So I had Roger recount a little bit about that team and about what it was like with Frank. But I remember working on the Danny Ainge recruit story out of North Eugene High School. And I remember calling and talking to his dad about Danny and talking to Danny and his coach and hearing the stories of him hitting a three-quarter full court shot at MacArthur Court in a state championship game. All-state football, all-state basketball. He was a receiver. He was an infielder. He a tremendous basketball player.
Well, and at the same time, he was playing for the Toronto Blue Jays
before he signed with the NBA. But Danny Ainge was a special talent, and Frank Arnold built one of the best teams that they've ever had. Greg Kite out of Texas. I remember doing a story on him out of Houston, Madison High School. It was a full-page story about Greg Kite. Now, he didn't turn out to be a superstar, but he was solid.
He was
strong,
a journeyman NBA guy for a long time.
And Fred Roberts, maybe one of the best LDS big men that have ever played the game. And Steve Trumbull, a tremendous rebounder. Steve Craig, a 10-flat, 100-yard dash sprinter. Greg Balla from Provo High School. But that team.
Remember Scott Runia?
Scott Runia was.
Devin Durant came in like a year later or so.
So that little era there was probably one of the pinnacles of BYU basketball. One of the best teams that they ever had.
No, the stories about Krešimir Ćosić, or however you pronounce it. I mean, he is renowned, almost saint-like. Is it Yugoslavia?
Yeah, in Croatia now. Zadar is his hometown. They have a statue of him there. His teammate Doug Richards has been there several times holding camps and wherever they go. In fact, today, BYU's basketball team went there this past summer and played, and people would come up and talk to him about him. Strangers that want to be introduced or get to know people in Croatia, they bring up Krešimir Ćosić. Yeah. Everyone knows him.
And politically, he was involved in their country, but an ambassador of good to everybody. And he died early of, I think, cancer.
42 years old.
Yeah.
44 or 42.
But I remember him playing against UCLA. We were converts to the church. I grew up outside of Sacramento in Rancho Cordova, California. And so I was generally back then it was the Pac-8, Pac-8 fan. But it was sure fun to see BYU play so well against a strong UCLA team and almost pulled it off, it felt like.
I was in the heyday of John Wooden. I mean, those are some of his best teams.
Oh, and they maybe the best coach ever in basketball.
Absolutely.
Until our current new basketball coach that we have, right?
Kevin Young's done some amazing things.
Yeah, for 1 month on the job.
Amazing.
It's fun to watch.
He's having the top 40 players in America in high school coming on campus right now.
I'm a little worried, Dick, that we're taking some oxygen away from our football program.
Well, it's that time of the year. I mean, you got the transfer portal, which has become another well of stories during this time.
Yes.
I mean, there's nothing to write of it. There's no games going on. There's no football games going on. There's no basketball games going on. You got spring football over. So what are you going to write about? Well, with the new transfer portal thing, you write about recruiting.
You have to talk about that.
And that right now, that's the way it is all over the country, not just here with BYU sucking the oxygen out of football, but it's that way all across the country because basketball recruiting right now is the top really story for college beat reporters.
And Kevin Young has jumped out of the airplane running, and it's so fun as a Cougar fan to anticipate and I loved Mark Pope. When he announced he was going to Kentucky, I thought, oh no, what are we going to do now? And the powers that be said, here's what we're doing. And it's kind of interesting.
It's very interesting. What's interesting to me is the new president and the administration, the board of trustees has given him a green light to create a basketball program and to give him the resources and the funds. And the people that run NIL are boosters. They work with other boosters who have money, and they're allowing them to do their job and paint their interests with the brush that they want to. And what you're seeing is the results of that. And it's kind of exciting.
It seems like this NIL collective is maybe bringing out smaller donations from a lot more people and helping perhaps equally in bringing this out. Do you have an opinion on that, or what do you think?
Well, I think what's happened with BYU is that they've tread very carefully.
They have to.
They have to, because of the philosophical aspects of paying to have athletes pay. But I think what's happened, and this is right down your alley because you understand this, I think what's happened, and I'm not sure, but there's been some kind of a fund set up to where some big money boosters have put money in there to grow. And for instance, the coaches circle.
So they've set up a foundation.
Yeah. So the coaches circle, which really helps pay for coaches' salaries. I've talked to the top people in there, and they've been able to get a 20% refund or investment on their investment.
Wow.
And now you've been in this business a long time. 20% is not usual. It's probably very unusual.
That's an atypical year. If you're in the stock market, you're expecting 10 to 12 on the long term, but sometimes you lose money and sometimes you get the 20%ers.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's the way it is. But these guys are so good at what they're doing that they can get a bulk amount of money, put it in, earn interest, and then have that kind of pay off over time in the future to take care. The money will take care of itself by the interest it makes. And so what we're talking about here, Mike, is BYU perhaps having a NIL budget of about $3 to $4 million per year. Maybe that's high. Maybe it's more like, say, 3. But not all that money has to be coming out at once to an athlete. Say a guy signs for $800,000. University of Utah made an offer to a tight end, an LDS tight end, and his family told me that they offered him $500,000
annually.
But it's not annually. It's $100,000, $125,000 a year if he goes 4 years or something like that. So when you hear these figures, they're not all right at once. That's kind of what it would be if you stayed for all 4 years.
I see.
So you hear the big number, but it could be increments of this or that or the other if they go out in time. But the the big guy from Utah that just transferred, he had an offer from an SEC school of $800,000, which is 3 times more than what Utah was paying him. And he felt good enough to come to BYU, and I don't know what the money figure is, but it had to be in that area. And if not, then other things were in consideration. But that's what we're talking about.
You know, Dick, it's interesting because BYU has had the tradition or has been known as being very conservative and tight-fisted. But now that you're in the Big 12, now that you have the transfer portal and the NIL, it almost seems that the NCAA or colleges will create a revenue stream off of primarily football and basketball, and that instead of backing away from this business opportunity, the school has decided through donors to join the fray and make it a business and make it a revenue-generating thing. And foundation accounting, you know, you might make 20% in a year, but generally the actuaries in the background are going to say, well, Dick, you have $1 million, and at 5%, that'll produce $50,000 a year. We're going to allow you to pay $50,000 a year with your millions. So you're going to have significant dollars in the background in your foundation account, to budget for those millions of dollars that you're going to pay.
Right. And the other thing, Mike, is BYU wandered in the wilderness of independence for about 10 years. They wanted to be in the Big Ten. They did everything they could to get in the Big Ten.
You mean the Pac-12?
No, the Big. The Big 12.
Yeah,
Did I say,
yeah.
Did I say Big
the
10?
Big 10.
No, the Big 12. They wanted to be there. They aligned with them. And a lot of people in the Midwest believe the same way and culturally that BYU does.
You're right.
They wanted to do that. Once they got invited in there, then you better be a member. You better be a competitive member. You better not embarrass yourself. And so I think they realized, and here's something that they never had before, an independence with the independent contract they had with ESPN, and say it was bringing in $6 or $8 million a year. Well, now you're going to almost quadruple that from the money that you get from the Big 12. And they're not getting a full share, I think, until next year.
But still, I mean,
that
we're in it
money,
for the long run.
But that money is tremendous to be able to hire coaches and pay them what a competitive salary and to help with other things. I mean, I've seen them do so many things, and I'm not saying they're just throwing money around, but
No,
they've
I'm
got
not either.
far more resources than they had 24 months ago. Far more resources.
That's interesting. That's good. And it is a different business model today than it was when I was there. The NCAA was designed to keep athletes from being paid back when I was playing.
Wink, wink, yes. Yeah.
Oh, well, I know. Wink, wink. Who knows what Alabama and Ohio State were doing back then?
Or SMU.
Oh, my heavens. We could talk forever about that, couldn't we?
Yeah.
Dick Harmon, journalist, Deseret News. You have to have seen some wonderful stories. You and I were talking earlier about a mutual friend, a guy who I really highly regard, quarterback. I mean, I played with the very best quarterbacks that we could have had back then. I lockered next to Gifford Nielsen my freshman year. My sophomore year, after a mission and redshirt year, Mark Wilson and Jim McMahon were split in time in 1978, my redshirt year. And then Mark Wilson started in 1979. Jim McMahon was in 80 and 81. Steve Young was his backup. Robbie Bosco came and was, I helped recruit him because I'm from the Sacramento area. So, I mean, we were known as Quarterback U. And so here, this school that had been known as a basketball school, all of a sudden is producing all these football players. And trust me, it wasn't just quarterbacks. On the team that I played on, I counted 24 guys that went on and played for more than a year in the NFL.
Wow.
And, I mean, isn't that amazing?
That is amazing.
I mean, 24 guys that played in the professionals. So it was interesting in the late 70s and early 80s how BYU was both a great basketball school, but we were also becoming known as a great football school. You were a journalist then, and I know the University of Utah is an important school in your bailiwick, but tell us a little bit about your following or actually reporting on BYU.
Well, you throw Ty Detmer in there, BYU has more Davey O'Brien award winners than any team in college football except Oklahoma.
Wow.
That's how good the quarterback stuff was. I remember going to practice and watching Norm Chow and some of the other coaches go through and practice and how perfect they were trying to get everything, how the execution was at such a high level.
Doug Scoville was a freak about perfect execution.
Yeah.
You had your trunk, your limb, and then you had to go out and do, whatever you were doing on that pattern, and everything had to be like dance steps perfect.
It was built on execution, and BYU had the athletes with the mindset and discipline to do that. I don't know that you could do that at Arizona State. I don't think you could do that at Michigan. I don't think you could do it at a couple of other schools back then.
Right.
But BYU was ahead of the curve because of the guys that they had that would listen.
A guy like Glenn Kozlowski, wasn't gifted with great size. I don't know if he was the fastest guy in the NFL, but he had enough speed. But my heavens, look at how well he did in the NCAA and then with the Bears.
And Glenn was amazing. I had a good talk with him the other week. But that brand of that offense at that time was ahead of its time, so far ahead of time. I don't think that college football defenses were that sophisticated.
They didn't know how to handle our ball control passing.
Exactly. And I think it wasn't until the advent of NFL defenses and coaches that came into college football that they started to slow BYU down. And they kind of have. And so I don't know if those days will come again to have that kind of quarterback production. We've had some very good quarterbacks the last 10 years, but we're used to seeing back in your time of BYU quarterbacks leading the NCAA in passing, in total offense, in completion percentage, being amongst the nation's best, breaking records. Jim McMahon, broke 60, 70 records. Ty Detmer broke like 123. Or it was over 100. Yeah, he held the record in the NCAA for touchdown passes at 123.
And it was so fun to see Doug Scoville, Ted Tollner, Mike Holmgren, Norm Chow coming up, in the learning curve.
And Roger French in there. A lot of people don't realize how good Roger French was at offense. I mean,
Yes.
he, Glenn Kozlowski told me, he says, Roger French knew more about things than people realize.
Go where you will on Roger French, LaVell Edwards, or that offensive scheming with Ty Detmer back then.
There's so many things. I think I probably have to focus on LaVell, because LaVell was such a unique person. It's like he did not have an ego, but he did. But
You have to have an ego.
You absolutely have to.
But he didn't show it.
No, he took that ego part of what drives men to be men, and he put it over in a corner. And then he allowed others to have their egos and to shine. I remember golfing with him at Riverside Country Club with the owner of Mac.
Mr. Mac.
Mr. Mac.
Yeah.
Who'd lost his son to the what's his name, the bomber? The Norman bomber.
Yeah, I remember that.
That killed those people. He
Yes.
lost his son. Who was anyway. We're golfing here, and there's a lot of pressure on Norm Chow back then. A lot of people.
Well, it was a learning curve.
He was the GOAT. You wanted to beat him if something went wrong, and so I'm golfing in the cart with LaVell, and I happened to mention about Norm and how's he doing and what do you think, and it's kind of funny, and he just kind of stopped, and he said, "Let's switch carts." Take your clubs and go with Steve.
You go golf with someone else. I don't want to talk.
He wasn't gonna say anything, and didn't want to be in a position to be interrogated about his offensive coordinator.
Interesting.
And as much as fun we were having, we were golfing in that.
Oh yeah.
But it was just kind of a way to say no.
Interesting.
But the other thing about LaVell, and maybe this will paint a picture of you. His wife, of course, wrote for the Daily Herald, wrote a column, and we knew each other. But on the week of the Utah State game in 1979, I had a little 2-year-old boy get hit by a Utah Pyro light truck and killed. And
Your son?
My son.
Oh, no.
And I remember that week and how painful it was and what we were going through and everything. And then the funeral and the viewing line. Everything's just crazy. You have all these weird feelings. But there was LaVell Edwards and Patty during that week of the Utah State game that came to the funeral viewing and shook our hand, me and my wife, and comforted us. And I'll never forget that.
Yeah.
That's the kind of man he was. Here's a sports writer, hasn't even began his career. I'd only been in this business a few years. 1979, October the 9th.
Wow.
Is when he died, and that was the Utah State game. But he felt it more important to pay respect to his wife's coworker that day, that night, after practice, than anything else he could have done. Now, how do you think that made me feel? How would I ever write anything horribly bad about or criticize him ever again? And I have, but that's how hard it is, because he made it hard because of the human being that he was first before he was a football coach.
I tell you, Dick, when you go through high school sports, our coaches in high school are generally, Napoleonic. They're just powerful, and they were. I had some wonderful high school coaches, and they were leaders of men or young men. When you get to college, I read about Bear Bryant and how he was kind of remote and that leadership style worked. But when I got to BYU, we had some unbelievable coaches all over the place. I didn't realize how good they were.
But Mike, how did they pay him to get him there? They didn't. They didn't have any money, did they?
It was LaVell.
It had to be LaVell. But how would they get a Doug Scoville or a Mike Holmgren to come?
In today's world, they'd have to pay millions of dollars.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
I don't know if it'd be millions, but it'd be close to it. I think some of the coordinators now, are getting probably $1 million. But back then, I would be surprised if they were paying some of those guys $75,000 or $80,000 to come.
No, I mean, the dollar has changed a lot since then, but it was very low relative to
they were so good.
But I tell you what, BYU became a launching pad when you look at Ted Toller, Mike Holmgren, Doug Scoville, and then, of course, Andy Reid. And guys who came from this program and learned from LaVell. What I wanted to say, though, is that LaVell, as a freshman, straight out of a great high school program, Cordova High School out of California, I looked at LaVell Edwards like, wow, he's not anything like my high school coach. He kind of sits there and bites his tongue all the time. That was my first impression. Like, what's he doing? And trust me, my attitude and understanding of leadership over the rest of my life has seen that, man, that dude knew how to lead people. And you said it earlier. He led with no ego. He somehow put that aside. I like the way you put that, and allowed other people to have the accolades. And he probably accepted all the blame when there was any blame that needed to be given.
Yeah, and I think Kalani Sitake now is trying to be. He's not trying to be LaVell Edwards, but he likes the way that LaVell Edwards treated people and let people do their job and let his assistants do that. And a lot of people criticize Kalani because he thinks he should have fired a guy 3 or 4 years ago or whatever, but he's trying to build a relationship-based thing where he trusts people to do their job. And then I don't know how that's working out for him, because he gets a lot of backlash and a lot of flack for some of the things that he does say or does not say, or say in the way that people want him to, or to hold people accountable publicly, or just fire them on the spot. It's done up the street with 3 or 4 offensive coordinators in a row. Why can't he just hold somebody accountable? Fire him. But he's trying to be like LaVell.
He is. Although, when you think about it, when you hear Jim McMahon's quotes, 1978 was a tough year for us. That was my redshirt year, and we did have, it seems like half of our next year's team was redshirting that year in 1978. And like I said, Jim and Mark were splitting time at quarterback.
Very hard thing.
So we had a marginal year. And Jim McMahon has not been afraid to say that we needed to get rid of a particular offensive coordinator. And I think Jim was so frustrated with the situation that he was even considering going somewhere else. And he went and told LaVell that. And LaVell did make the hard decisions when they needed to be made.
Yeah, Wally English you're talking about.
Right.
Yep. Weird guy.
And so, yeah, whatever, and I've talked to other guys since then who've said that Wally's doing fine and has done well, but he didn't fit.
Right.
In the program that we had. And Doug Scoville had set up a program, then left and came back. And it was funny how Mike Holmgren kind of enveloped what Doug Scoville had created, and took it further. So you're right. Kalani's doing a great job, and I'm crossing my fingers. I truly hope that our football team can take that oxygen back. And we're in a tough program. We're in a tough league.
Well, you also got the toughest schedule in the Big 12. You're playing the top 7 best teams in that league. Utah's playing the top 7 weakest teams in that league. Both Utah and BYU are going to travel almost close to 10,000 miles next year for interconference play.
Wow.
That's a lot of travel at Oklahoma State and Baylor.
Are we having to go to like West Virginia or something?
No, we did that last year.
Yeah, that's true.
BYU did that last year, but I think you got a trip coming up to a couple of other places that are far away. But it's going to be hard. But I think this will be a better football team. I think they've got more depth and talent on defense. I think their offensive line will be taught, coached, and brought along better than they were last year. And they've got more talent than they had. Depth-wise, I think they've got 10 or 12 choices of people that they can develop, and I think the quarterback situation will surprise people.
Good.
I think
I saw that he had potential.
Yeah, I think last year they got caught in an injury situation with Slovis, and he struggled. When he struggled, you threw a guy out there against some very good defenses, and he struggled. But he also made some pretty good plays, and I think we haven't seen the best of him, but we will.
And that's what gives me this this well of hope, and we're praising and cheering for Kalani and the team because I love what he's trying to do, and I know that there's a learning curve, and he's way ahead of me.
Well, he made some tough decisions. He got rid of his offensive line coach, Darryl Funk. People were not responding to him. He's gone. He got rid of the tight end coach, who was a good close friend of mine that I've known for 20 years, Steve Clark, who's just a tremendous guy. I love that guy.
Steve.
And the players loved him, and recruits loved him.
Right.
And he's brought in an NFL tight end coach. And he's made some changes there that I think will be extremely productive, not only in recruiting, but in execution. He's made the changes he needs to do.
More power to them. We're excited about this upcoming season. In your reporting, what's a story that has been most compelling to you that's given you inspiration? You're writing the stories so frequently, but what's one of the stories that you've written that even was inspiring for you, that afterwards you said, wow, that was a home run?
Just the other day, I'm trying to think of what you want, but just the other day, because it's in my mind, I call Roger Reid. Roger Reid spends his days now taking care of his wife who has Alzheimer's. He dresses her, he feeds her, he gives her medicine.
Where do they live?
They live in Spanish Fork. 12 hours a day, her waking hours, he serves her. Wow. And he told me, he says, Dick, my wife, Diane, who is a master teacher in Nebo School District, a master teacher when she had her mind. He said, my wife supported me and my boys in everything we did. She was there for every game,
and
every
he had
practice.
Some accomplished kids that were busy.
They were very busy, but they were all good academics. They're straight A students. Randy Reid ended up working in your business, but anyway, I called him yesterday, and Roger and I have a lot of history. I broke the story of when he was fired by BYU.
Oh.
And I called him on the phone to tell him it was going down.
The story or the firing?
The firing. He didn't
know?
He didn't know that.
Oh, my heavens.
And I said, did you understand this was going to happen? And that was a hard thing because I was interjecting myself into the story, which I did not want to do. I didn't want to be a part of that. But I knew Roger, and I thought that I would try to get a comment out of him, something I thought he did know. He didn't. Uh-oh. So we go way back. But I called him the other day to ask him about Frank Arnold passing.
Yes. And I remember Frank Arnold, when I came back, coached some of the best teams BYU had in basketball in the 70s. Did he go into the early 80s?
Yes. That's the year that they made it the Elite Eight.
That's right.
But I call Roger, and he's chipper, he's gracious, he's happy to talk to me. He says, let me give you some stuff for your column. So he talked to me. He says, I was at Clearfield High School, and he called me. Frank Arnold called me and hired me and offered my first job in college. I never probably would have got a job at the college level if it wasn't for Frank Arnold. He talked about how Frank brought him in. He says, we're wearing shirt and ties every day at work. You be in here at 8 o'clock. You'll be here all the time until 8. Made the players dress, when they went on road trips, dressed like they were missionaries. And so he took me through the things that they would do and what John Wooten's influence was on that. But you ask about an inspiring story. To me, Roger today talking and responding to me and helping me with a column is inspiring to me. Because look at what's on his plate with his life.
Yeah.
But he was eager to do that.
Well, you've made so many good friends. And it's fun to hear that story about LaVell Edwards. And you were going down a path that a lot of people were frustrated at the time with Norm Chow, and LaVell just didn't want to deal with it. I assume that you and LaVell were always good friends, and that you golfed later.
Well, he's always been gracious to me.
Yeah.
There's not a bad bone in his body. I don't think, and I've heard him say some things here and there and joke around on that. He had a tremendous sense of humor, but
he really did.
No, he had respect for me that day when I was nobody, and I will never forget that. Another thing, and you knew Jim McMahon really well.
Of course. But in fact, Jim, I'll tell this. You tell me the story.
Well, I'm sitting here. I'm working at the Daily Herald. I think I'm a police reporter then. But on the side, I'm keeping my foot in sports. and I'm doing a radio show 3 times a week down at Kovo, Kovo. Now, that's way, way down in West Provo, way back in the boondocks. You can hardly find it. And I made a request to Jim McMahon to come and be on the radio show for 20 or 30 minutes after practice. And he said he'd be there. But Mike, I didn't expect him to be there for a couple of reasons. He's a busy guy. He's a superstar.
Right.
He's got a girlfriend. He's got a green duster. Yeah. Remember the green duster?
I do remember the green duster.
So there's so many things that he could have done. And like I say, I'm nobody. I'm just trying to make a few shekels.
And you want to drag him out by the lake.
I don't even know how to get there. I go out there to do the radio show, and I hardly know where it was. But me and Jim Walker were doing the show, and the time came when it was his segment to be there. And I look at my watch, and I'm thinking, is he going to make it? We'll be lucky if we get this guy. All of a sudden, there's a knock at the studio door, and it's Jim McMahon. Nancy's out in the car waiting for him. He comes in there, sits down for 25 minutes to speak to nobody, but to help me out because I made that request. Another story I could give you is about Ty Detmer.
Yeah.
Before he came to BYU, he was a superstar. But when he got to BYU, he was nobody really because he was a freshman. He hadn't done anything yet. But during that summer, there's 2 requests I made of him because I followed him the whole year since he committed as a junior. I followed and covered his games, had his coaches on the radio. But we're out there, we're out of their Boy Scout camp out at Schofield Lake. And I asked Ty if he'll come out and spend some time in the fireside and, just talk to the boys. I didn't think he'd do it. It's a long ways out there. It's an hour and a half.
Yeah.
But at the appointed time, I go out to a dirt road that will meet the dirt road that takes us to our camp because I had told him generally the direction that he is. And within 4 minutes, he was there in his SUV, and he had made it. Later that summer, there was a guy in my ward that was dying. He was in the hospital. He had sepsis. And I said, Ty, could you come over? He's read about you. Could you go over and just visit with this guy? He said, sure, I'll be there. And I didn't think he would. But he came in the hospital, came by his bedside, gave him a signed autograph ball, sat there and talked to him for a while, tried to build up his spirits. He died 5 days later. Those are the kind of guys that I've been associated with that request, they've come. And I'm nobody. I'll never forget that.
Dick, you've never been nobody, but I understand exactly where you're coming from, and that's a beautiful thing. We were talking earlier about a fun story Vi Sikahema told, and he told me this years ago, and then he shared it on our podcast. But Jim McMahon and he were on the same team. This was near the end of Jim's career, so he's playing for the Philadelphia Eagles. They were flying into Washington, D.C. to play back then, the Redskins. And Jim and Vi, when they get to the hotel that night, I don't know how many days before the game, Jim asked Vi, said, Vi, what are you doing tonight? Vi said, got nothing planned. Watching TV, I guess. And Jim said, meet me down in the lobby in 10 minutes. Okay? Vi said, sure. So Jim and Vi, they go up, check into their rooms, and they meet in the lobby. Jim gets a taxi, and Jim takes Vi out to some, home, a halfway house, a drug rehab center is what it was. And one of our old teammates, Jim was funding his drug rehab.
Wow.
And wanted to make this visit to one of our old teammates who's there in Washington, D.C. And Vi told the story about how Jim and he and our old teammates sat down together, and Vi was just so impressed that, and they met with him. They loved him. And he appreciated their visit. And when you talk about, these guys are superstars, they have a lot of other things they could do.
Jim McMahon was a minister that day. He's doing his ministry.
Exactly. When we talk about we're supposed to be ministers, there's Jim McMahon being a minister. So Vi tells the story of, he would tease Jim, say, Jim, except for being baptized, you'd be the best bishop the church ever had, because any of the problems anyone comes to you with, you've already done that twice. So you understand it.
That's great.
And it is great. And it brought tears to my eyes when Vi told about our ex-teammate and how Jim cared about that man who obviously was suffering.
I know who that is. We're not going to mention it, but how is he doing?
I guess he's doing better.
Good.
And it's fun to see Jim doing so much better. For a long time, they were talking about CTE and how that was bothering Jim. And then Jim found a facility. CTE is the traumatic brain injury that a lot of concussions, concussive. And Jim's doing great. The last time I saw Jim, he claimed that he's never felt better. And our friend is doing better too.
Another thing people don't realize about Jim, and you've seen him, is how good a shape he's in.
Yeah.
He looks like he's in better shape than he was in college.
That's probably true. But he looks more of like a long distance runner now than a
Yeah.
But Dick, I'm so happy that you were able to come on board with us today and share.
My pleasure.
I mean, I know this is like an iceberg. You probably have you've forgotten more stories than I could ever tell. Thank you for all the good memories and the new memories.
Well, thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks for being here, and keep up the good work. And we'll cross our fingers for our Cougs this year in both football and basketball, that we're going to even surpass our expectations.
I think it will.
I do too.
I think this team will be better than people think.
That's great. That's all we need.
When you lose and you get disrespected, it does something to you.
It does.
And that's what happened.
It lights a little bit of a fire, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You work a little bit harder, spend a little bit more time in the weight room, run a little faster.
And, I loved Kyle Whittingham. The Utes are a great program. It'll be fun when we meet them again this year. And again, we'll cross our fingers. They have a great program going on too. So
they do.
It'll be a tough year, but a good one.
Well, thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Dick. Let's go golfing sometime. Let's do it.
Let's do it.